One afternoon, a pastor called the home of one of his members, and a young voice answered and said, "Hello." And the pastor says, "Hello, who's this?" And the voice said, "This is Jimmy." And so the pastor replied, "Well, Jimmy, is your dad home?" And Jimmy said, "Yes." And the pastor said, "Can I talk to him?" And Jimmy said, "He's busy right now." And so the pastor was curious, and he said, "Well, is your mom home?" And Jimmy said, "Yes." And the pastor said, "Well, can I speak to her?" And Jimmy said, "She's busy right now." And so now this really caught the pastor's attention. So he said, "Are there any other adults there?" And Jimmy said, "Well, there's the policeman." And the pastor said, "Well, can I talk to them?" And Jimmy says, "They're busy right now." "Well, is there anyone else there?" And Jimmy says, "The fireman." And the pastor says, "Well, can I talk to the fireman?" And Jimmy says, "No, they're busy right now." And so the pastor said, "Jimmy, what are they all busy doing?" And Jimmy says, "They're busy looking for me." Now, I love that story because Jimmy is hiding and everyone is looking for him. And you know, when I first heard that story, one of the things that came to my mind was the fact that there are a lot of people that are hiding. Now, maybe they're not hiding like Jimmy is hiding, where he's hiding from his parents, or maybe they are hiding from their parents. Maybe they're also, like Jimmy, hiding from the police. But one of the reasons that people hide, right, we hide is because oftentimes we want to hide because we've done something wrong, especially when we were children. But I think today, even as adults, one of the reasons that we hide is because we don't want other people to see who we really are. We don't want other people to know us too well. We are afraid of what they might think of if they really knew us. Today we're continuing our series on holding the door open, and what we have been talking about is how the reason that we hold the door open for other people, the reason that we do that is because we want to make it easier for them to come through the door, to make it easier for people to come in. And as part of the family of God, especially if you are a follower of Jesus, and as most especially if you are part of the Gracepoint Church family, one of the things we want to do is to make it as easy as possible for people to come through the door, to come through and to see Jesus. One of the interesting things that we found is that, even when people do come through the door, some of them still want to remain hidden, even though they're there, because a lot of times, especially for people who are visiting a church for the first time, they don't know what to expect. They don't know who they are going to meet on the other side of that door. In fact, one of the most notable characteristics of the early church was that for the people who came through the door, who entered in, it was a place of refuge, a place where everyone was accepted. And no matter where you were in the culture, in the socioeconomic ladder, you could come into the church and everyone was equal. It was a place where you could come and men sat together with women. Outside of the building, that was just unheard of. But there was no distinction between the two. Men and women sat together. Inside the church, slaves and masters sat together. There was no distinction between the two. The slave could be at home and comfortable sitting next to the master. The master could be at home and comfortable sitting next to the slave. The rich and the poor, they sat together. Those that were connected into society and those that were rejected by society, they all sat together in peace. The early church created an environment where everyone didn't just feel welcomed, but they were actually welcome. Inside, everyone had the same status. No one was better than anyone else. No one was worse than anyone else. It was the one place where people could come together, the one place in their lives where they were accepted by everybody and loved by everybody without agenda. And my hope has always been that here at Gracepoint, you feel the same way. When you come here, when you're watching us online, when you come here to visit us, or when you come here because this is your church and your church family, that you would feel the same way, that you would recognize and know that there's no one who is better than anybody else. There's no one who is worse than anyone else. We believe that what Jesus said was true, that we are all sinners. The Scripture tells us that we all fall short of the glory of God, that no one has been good enough. We're all in the same boat, but we are all saved. At the same time, we are all saved, and we are all the righteousness of God, and we are each one of us part of the priesthood of believers. If you're a person who serves here at Gracepoint, it doesn't mean that you're better than the person who doesn't. The person who gives here at Gracepoint doesn't mean that you are any better than the person who doesn't. Now, are there benefits to serving and to giving? Absolutely. It changes something inside you. It's an opportunity for you to express your gratitude and to serve others. But does it make us any better than anyone or any worse than anyone? No, it doesn't, because we're all the same. We are all equal. And we try really, really hard to create that welcoming space. It's always been an important part of who we are as a church. But I have to tell you, it's even more important in the culture that we live in today. Because we have inadvertently, I believe, designed a culture that allows all of us to remain hidden in plain sight. Social media has become a personality shield. For those of you who are Star Trek fans like me, it's a personality cloaking device. Because social media has allowed us to project a personality that doesn't have to be who we are. In fact, oftentimes the personality that's projected on social media is not who the person is. The devices that we hold in our hands, our phones and our tablets, they have become a walking do not disturb sign. That when we want people to know that they shouldn't bother us, we just make sure that we're staring directly at the screen while we're sitting or walking around. I recently heard this interesting statistic that the loneliest people in church aren't the widows or the older single adults, but that the loneliest people in church today are those that are in their 30s, those who are most susceptible to culture and to technology and to social media. Because even though people try so hard to remain hidden, one of the things we know is what they really want is to be known. Deep down inside, we try to stay hidden, but what we want is to be known. For people to know us and to still love us and accept us as we are. And listen, as a church, we have an opportunity to create a place where people can come and feel comfortable being hidden, and then feel safe being known. A place where people can come and see Jesus and hear about Jesus. You know, creating welcoming spaces was one of the things that Jesus was great at doing. And in our time together today, I'm going to take us through one of the events in Jesus' life that I think captures his spirit of hospitality, the spirit of hospitality that he wants us to have as we hold the door open for people and make it easier for them to come in, to come through, and to see Jesus. It starts in a book that was written by a man named Luke. Luke was a physician. He was a scientist. He was very intelligent, and he said at the beginning of this book that he wrote that he interviewed people and talked to people because he wanted to give a detailed account of Jesus' life. And in the 19th chapter of his book, he starts off telling us this little event in Jesus' life. He starts telling us like this. He says, Jesus entered Jericho and made his way through the town. Now, Jericho was known in the area for its rich soil. In fact, Josephus, who is one of the ancient historians, called Jericho the little paradise. The little paradise is what he called Jericho. Now, Jesus at this time, he is on his way to Jerusalem. And he's coming to the end of his time together here physically on earth. And one of the last stops that he was going to make before going into Jerusalem was passing through the city of Jericho. Now, Jericho is only about 15 miles north of Jerusalem, so we know that this is really coming to the end of his trip. It's not very far away. And Jesus expects, and as we know from history, that Jesus is going to be in Jerusalem at the time of the Passover. So this event happened sometime in the early spring. Jesus is walking through, and he walks through the city of Jericho. Jericho has at that time, there was a great palm forest, and there were also groves of balsam trees. It was so powerful and so beautiful that those balsam trees perfumed the area for miles around. Luke goes on to say that there was a man there, in Jericho. He said there was a man there named Zacchaeus. He was the chief tax collector in the region, and he had become very rich. Now, if you've been following along with the story of Jesus, one of the things you know is that this isn't the first time Jesus has run into a tax collector. One of his disciples, one of his followers, one of the very first people that Jesus called was a man named Matthew, who was a tax collector. But Zacchaeus was not just a regular tax collector, he was the chief of the tax collectors. And at that time, tax collectors were not very popular. And Luke says here that not only was he the chief tax collector, but he says he had become very rich. And the way that it's phrased there, Luke is telling us that he had become rich by being a crooked tax collector. See, Zacchaeus wasn't just a tax collector who was hated by his people, but he had become rich being a dishonest tax collector. And so a lot of people who would have read this at the time, listening to Luke, would probably have laughed at how Luke framed this statement, because Zacchaeus' name comes from the Hebrew word zakak, which means clean and pure. And so Luke's statement there would have read, here's a man named clean and pure who taxed his own people to become filthy rich. I think people would have read that and they would have just laughed at the irony. Luke goes on and he says, this is Zacchaeus, tried to get a look at Jesus, but he was too short to see over the crowd. See, all Zacchaeus wanted to do was to see Jesus. Zacchaeus didn't want to be saved. Zacchaeus didn't want to be healed. Zacchaeus didn't want to be forgiven. He had simply heard stories about Jesus. He had heard stories about what Jesus had done in the lives of other people, and he wanted to see for himself. Story goes on and says, this is Zacchaeus, ran ahead. Like he saw Jesus coming, and so he's trying to figure out where he can position himself so that he can see Jesus. So he ran ahead and he climbed a sycamore fig tree beside the road, for Jesus was going to pass that way. Right? So in other words, he knew where Jesus was going, so he situated himself in a place where Jesus was going to walk by where he was. Now, just before this, in the previous chapter, Luke tells us the story of another man who wanted to see Jesus. A man that they referred to as blind Bartimaeus. Now, they called him blind Bartimaeus, probably as you can figure out, because he was blind. And blind Bartimaeus knew that Jesus was walking by. He wants to see Jesus too. And so blind Bartimaeus is yelling, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. He's there on the ground. He can't see where Jesus is. And so he just starts to yell, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Blind Bartimaeus doesn't care who hears him. He doesn't care what's going on around him. He is just yelling because he wants to see Jesus. But Zacchaeus is different. Zacchaeus wants to stay anonymous. He doesn't want anyone to know he's there. He doesn't want anyone to see him looking. He wants to see Jesus too, but he doesn't want to be seen. You know, generally there are two types of people who visit churches for the first time. Some of them are like blind Bartimaeus. They want to see Jesus. They want to see what the commotion is about. So they come in and they're loud. And they don't mind if people see them. They don't mind if people hear him. They don't care if people know that he's there. He just wants to see Jesus. And there are people who come to church for the first time, and that's how they are. But the overwhelming majority of people who visit a church for the first time aren't like blind Bartimaeus. They're like Zacchaeus. They don't want to be seen. They want to stay anonymous. They want to get in a good position to see what's going on around them. They just want to sit quietly and watch. They just want to see. And that's why here at Gracepoint, one of the things that I talk about all the time, one of the things that you've probably heard me talk about is how much we value the ministry of sitting in the front. Now here we have a big space. It's a lot bigger than what we need right now. And what we want to do is, as we make it easy for people, one of the ways we make it easy for people to come in and to be like Zacchaeus, where they are hidden in plain sight, where they're anonymous, but they can come and see, is by reserving those back seats for the people who come in and don't want to be seen right away. In fact, most people who come to visit usually come a little bit late so that they can sneak in without there being a big commotion. And so we tell people here, listen, it is a whole ministry for you to simply come and sit at the front. It is a huge part of the ministry here at our church. You see, a lot of people visit a church because they want to see Jesus, but they don't want anyone to see them. Luke goes on and he says, when Jesus came by, he looked up at Zacchaeus. Now, why did Zacchaeus have to climb up a tree to see Jesus? Yeah, he was short, sure, but lots of people have seen Jesus. Lots of people his height have seen Jesus. They've seen him walking on the road. They've seen him talking in the synagogue, teaching in the synagogue. They've seen him preaching on the mountainside. They've seen him healing people in and around the temple. Why didn't Zacchaeus just go to one of those places? Why was it that he had to go and climb up a tree? In fact, remain hidden in the tree. Well, remember, Zacchaeus was the chief tax collector. And while it wasn't illegal to be a tax collector, Zacchaeus was hated by the people as if he was the worst criminal there was. They treated him worse than the worst criminal, because he was a tax collector, and he was a cheating tax collector. He collected taxes from his own people that he was supposed to protect. Instead, he took advantage of them, and he took those taxes not for the benefit of the people, but for the benefit of Rome, the empire that had captured their land and was oppressing their people. Their sworn enemy was who Zacchaeus was working for. You see, it wasn't that it was illegal for Zacchaeus to go where Jesus was. It was that no one wanted him there. No one wanted Zacchaeus anywhere near where Jesus was. He was an outcast. He was rejected by society. They didn't like the way that he lived his life. They didn't like the way that he dressed. They didn't like the people that he hung out with. And they would rather exclude him from their religious practices than deal with who the person was on the inside. And sometimes I have to wonder, do we do that too? As a church, do we do that too? Are there people who are just too messy, whose lives are just too complicated to deal with, that we would just rather not? Are there people like that? That we just say, well, let's just let them be someone else's problem. You know, there's some other ministry that's better equipped to handle people like that. I'm sure there's some governmental agency that is taking care of people like that. After all, isn't that where all my tax money is going to? Zacchaeus was one of those people like that. Zacchaeus wasn't allowed to the areas where people meet Jesus. And so instead, he figured out where Jesus was going, where Jesus was going to be, and he waited for Jesus there. Now, who climbs up a tree, right? Kids. When we were kids, we climbed up trees all the time. Do we see adults climbing up trees? Sometimes, but rarely. You know what you never see is you never see a fully dressed business suit adult climbing up a tree. Rich, wealthy businessmen, fully dressed in the middle of the day, with crowds of people around, don't climb up trees. But Zacchaeus did. And for the reality for Zacchaeus was that most people probably didn't even notice him climbing up the tree, and most people could care less. But for Zacchaeus, it was different. For him, it was embarrassing to have to climb up a tree. It was intimidating. I don't know how far ahead he must have run so that people wouldn't see him climbing up the tree. I mean, he must have been up on that tree and thought, what if people saw him and they laughed? Or what if he fell right in front of everybody? What if people saw him and they stopped and started pointing at him? What if they could see under his brand new custom-tailored Armani robe while he was climbing up that tree? In fact, despite what we see in a lot of the pictures that you might have seen when you were growing up of Zacchaeus meeting Jesus, where Zacchaeus is kind of hanging there on the very lowest branch, you see that, and then there's Jesus and the people around him, and so it's really easy to see Zacchaeus. The reality is that Zacchaeus probably was up in that tree, and he probably chose the sycamore fig tree because of the height of its branches and the number of leaves that it had covering it. And this is an actual picture of the tree that Zacchaeus climbed. Now, this is 2,000 years later. You can see this tree, over 2,000 years old, is still there. It's not as full and barren as a fully developed sycamore fig tree. But if Zacchaeus had climbed up in that tree, he would have been hidden. The leaves and the branches would have hidden him. And he would have wanted it that way because standing in a tree for a man of his stature was embarrassing. And listen, this is how it feels for a lot of people who come to visit a church for the first time. They come to see Jesus, but there's a sense of embarrassment to it, a sense of uncertainty, of not knowing what's going on. And that's why for us it's so important to make people feel less comfortable. One of the things we talked about the very first week was the fact that one of the most intimidating things for people when they visit a church is having to ask where the bathroom is. And so how do we make people feel a little less uncomfortable, a little more comfortable? We have signs that say where the bathroom is so that people don't have to go through the tension of having to ask. There's less pressure. Do we try to be friendly with people? Absolutely. When people come through the door, we want to be friendly to them, but we have to remember that there's a sweet spot. Right? You want to be friendly and welcoming, but not smothering. Because a lot of people want to remain hidden. You know, it's one of the biggest things that we do. We have a coffee bar where we offer coffee and water. And you can grab a coffee or a water bottle. You actually have to come through by the coffee bar before you come inside into the worship center. Because one of the things we know is that when you're in an unfamiliar place, if you're holding a drink in your hand, it makes you feel more at ease. So we try to do what we can to make people feel welcomed and feel comfortable when they come, because that removes the barrier for people to have an opportunity to see Jesus. And so Jesus is walking, and he looks up and he sees Zacchaeus in the tree. And Luke says, he calls him by name. Zacchaeus, he said, quickly, come down. See, the first thing that Jesus does is take him out of a place of embarrassment and puts him into a place where he feels comfortable. He takes him out of the discomfort and brings him to a place where he can just be himself. And then Jesus looks at him and says, I must be a guest in your home today. Now, Jesus is interesting because he knows to look up, even though Zacchaeus was trying to remain hidden. He knows Zacchaeus' name. He calls him by name. And where does Jesus want to take Zacchaeus? He wants to take him to a place where Zacchaeus would feel comfortable. And there's very few places in the world where we feel more comfortable than in our own homes. Now, the translation of that phrase can get a bit iffy here because when we read it, it sounds to us like Jesus is insisting that he's going to Zacchaeus' house, right? He's saying, I must go to your house today. But what Jesus is saying when we read it in the original Greek, it's not a command as much as it is an offer or a suggestion. And Zacchaeus' response is, he quickly climbed down and took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. Listen to how Eugene Peterson, the author of the Message translation of the Scriptures, put it. He writes, when Jesus got to the tree, he looked up and said, Zacchaeus, hurry down. Today is my day to be a guest in your home. Zacchaeus scrambled out of the tree, hardly believing his good luck, delighted to take Jesus home with him. You see, all throughout Luke's account of Jesus' life, Jesus is always going to someone's house. Whenever he goes to a place, he's going to someone's house to eat. And Jesus is so popular that people are always inviting him to come to eat at their house, to come over and visit their house. So when Jesus tells Zacchaeus that today was the day that he's going to go to his house, Zacchaeus was delighted. He was overjoyed. He thought, wow, how lucky am I that today is the day he's coming to my house. And let's remember, who's hosting this party? It's not Zacchaeus. It's Jesus. Jesus is the one extending the hospitality. Jesus is the one who's the host, even though it's at Zacchaeus' house. Jesus is the one who's saying, Zacchaeus, I want to spend time with you. You are that special to me that I want to spend time with you. But what Luke says happens next is what really tells us who Zacchaeus was. Listen, when Jesus said, I must have dinner at your house, I must be a guest at your house, listen to the response of the people around. Luke says, but the people were displeased. He has gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner, they grumbled. You know how people grumble. They're grumbling because they're unhappy that of all the people in the town who Jesus could have gone to their house, they're going to Zacchaeus' house, the chief tax collector and cheat who's been taking advantage of the people. You see, Zacchaeus wasn't the type of person that people went out to dinner with. He wasn't the type of person that people were seen in public with. Zacchaeus was an outcast from the culture, from the people. He was a reject. Zacchaeus was one of those who was hidden in plain sight. But this is the person who Jesus shows hospitality to. And this is who the type of person that Jesus invites you and me to show hospitality to. Not just like people like Zacchaeus, but to everybody, to everyone. We have an opportunity to hold the door open for them, to allow them to come through, to make it easier for them to come in and to see Jesus. Because one of the things that we know is that when you see Jesus, your life will change. Look at what happens next to Zacchaeus. It says, meanwhile, while all this grumbling was going on, meanwhile, Zacchaeus stood before the Lord and said, I will give half my wealth to the poor, Lord, and if I have cheated people on their taxes, I will give them back 4 times as much. See, this was not something that Jesus told Zacchaeus that he had to do. It wasn't something that Jesus guilted Zacchaeus into doing. Jesus didn't say, listen, we've had fun tonight, but until you make things right, we're not going to go any farther in this relationship. That's not what Jesus said. This was something that Zacchaeus did as a response to Jesus showing him hospitality. It was Zacchaeus' response to having an encounter with Jesus, with meeting Jesus and seeing Jesus and spending time with Jesus. Because when you meet Jesus and you spend time with Jesus, something will change, and something changed in Zacchaeus that day. And listen, there's nothing in the scriptures or in history that would lead us to believe that Zacchaeus would all of a sudden become poor after doing all of this. In fact, Zacchaeus would be able to give away half of his wealth and pay 4 times the amount of taxes that he cheated people with and still be the wealthiest person in Jericho. But he was still intent on making it right. And this is Jesus' response to Zacchaeus. Jesus responded, "Salvation has come to this home today, for this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham." You notice Jesus says salvation. Salvation has come because of what happened in Zacchaeus' heart. What Zacchaeus did was simply an outward manifestation of the inward change inside him. And then Jesus tells us, and Jesus tells you and me, why this is so important. Jesus tells us why, what his entire purpose for coming here was. And Jesus tells us the mission that he invites you and me into. Jesus tells us the reason why it's so important for us to hold the door open for the next person. Listen to what Jesus says. He says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and save those who are lost." You see, Zacchaeus didn't climb up that tree that day thinking that Jesus was going to be his Lord and Savior. He didn't climb up the tree that day thinking that Jesus was going to be the solution to his problems. He wasn't trying to be saved. He wasn't trying to be forgiven. All he was doing was trying to see this person, Jesus, that he had heard about. He wanted to meet Jesus. He wanted to see what Jesus was all about. And that is why most people come to church for the first time. Like Zacchaeus, they just want to see Jesus. And here's the thing. You and I are responsible for making Jesus' first impression to those people. One of the things that we do, and we know we do, is we prejudge people based on who their family and friends are. We know their family, we know their friends, we make a decision about who they are, and people do the same thing with Jesus. People will prejudge Jesus. Jesus followers, are you listening to me? People will prejudge who Jesus is based on who you and I are, how we live our lives. The things that you and I do, that's how they will judge Jesus. And the people who are on the outside, and listen, there's a lot of people also who are on the inside. Maybe some of the people who, like Zacchaeus, are left on the margins, who've been ruled out of bounds, but who often surprise us by their faith and their generosity after they've had a chance to meet Jesus. Listen, anyone who really wants to see Jesus, who has a real desire to see Jesus, will. Anyone. But even more than that, anyone who has a real desire to see Jesus will in turn be seen by Jesus. And that has the potential to change someone's life. For some of us, someone else made us feel comfortable enough to meet Jesus, to see Jesus, and that changed our lives. So I want to invite you to keep holding the door open, to keep doing everything you can to make it easier for people to come in, to come through, and to meet Jesus. Because holding the door open for other people lets them know that they are welcome here.
thank you for joining us for this week's message. Gracepoint Church is located in South San Francisco, California. For additional content or to find out more information about Gracepoint Church, visit us online at wearegracepoint.com.